The boardroom air at the Manhattan headquarters of Sterling and Holloway was recycled and thin, recycled through a ventilation system that seemed to hum with the precise, rhythmic agitation of a nervous heartbeat. For 3 years, Julian Vane had been the architect of what many considered the most ambitious commodities hedge of the decade. His firm, Vane Capital, had quietly accumulated a position in industrial-grade silver that was not just substantial, it was systemic. But today, the game wasn't about accumulation. It was about settlement. Julian sat across from Marcus Thorne, the lead clearing officer for the commodity exchange. Between them lay a manila folder, thin and unassuming, containing a document that effectively demanded the physical delivery of 6 million ounces of silver bullion. It was a request that, under normal market conditions, would have been a mundane clerical process. But these were not normal conditions. The registered inventories at the exchange had been drifting downward for 18 consecutive months, a slow-motion drain that the public chose to ignore, but which kept clearing officers awake at night. "Julian," Thorne began, his voice practiced in the art of corporate indifference, "we've reviewed your request. We understand your position regarding the maturity of these contracts. However, the exchange has the right to exercise a cash settlement clause under the force majeure provisions regarding logistics constraints. We're offering a cash premium at 10% over the current spot price. It is the most generous offer you will ever see on this desk." Julian didn't blink. He had spent the last 24 months mapping the exact geography of the global silver supply chain. He knew, with mathematical certainty, that the physical metal wasn't just sitting in a warehouse waiting to be shipped. It was being rehypothecated, leased, and moved between accounts in a shell game designed to keep the paper price from reflecting the reality of industrial scarcity. "I'm not interested in the premium, Marcus," Julian said, his voice steady. "I'm interested in the metal. The contract stipulates physical delivery. If the silver is in the vaults as your daily reports claim, then there is no logistical constraint. If the silver is not in the vaults, then your daily reports are fraudulent. Either way, I am rejecting your offer. I want delivery initiated within 72 hours. Thorne leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. He had seen traders like Julian before, men who thought they could outsmart the institutional inertia of the commodities world. But Julian wasn't a gambler. He was an auditor who had weaponized his capital. He had spent years tracking the discrepancy between the exchange's registered silver, metal that was ready for delivery, and the eligible silver, which was merely stored there but not pledged. "You're playing a dangerous game, Julian," Thorne said quietly. "If you refuse this settlement, you are essentially initiating a stress test on the entire clearing mechanism. You know what happens when you turn a localized dispute into a systemic crisis. The regulators will not be kind to you." "The regulators are currently watching the same data I am," Julian countered, standing up. 3 days, Marcus. After that, I stopped playing the game." Julian walked out of the building and into the cold, sharp air of a November afternoon. He knew exactly what would happen the moment he exited the elevator. The lobby cameras were watching, and the calls would already be moving up the chain of command. He wasn't just a trader anymore, he was a liability. He pulled his phone from his pocket, opened an encrypted application, and sent a single text message to his lead developer: "The trigger is pulled. Execute Protocol 0. Protocol 0 wasn't a financial maneuver. It was a data dump. For years, Julian had been collecting metadata on the movement of every bar of silver registered at the exchange. He had cross-referenced shipping manifests, warehouse utility bills, and the private schedules of transport security firms. He had the proof that the vaults were not just depleted, they were empty. And in 3 days, when the deadline passed and the exchange failed to deliver the metal, the narrative of the plentiful silver market would dissolve. He caught a cab, watching the city blur past. The institutions relied on the fact that no one would ever actually demand delivery. They relied on the paper-to-physical ratio, a massive pyramid of derivative contracts that had no basis in real-world supply. By rejecting the cash settlement, Julian wasn't just asking for his silver, he was demanding the truth. He was forcing the market to stop pretending. As he reached his office, his inbox was already flashing with urgent notifications from lawyers and regulators. They were trying to reach him, to threaten him, to find a way to silence the demand. But it was too late. The dominoes were already falling, and he had set them in motion with a single, calm, and definitive rejection of the project's final offer. By the second day of the 72-hour countdown, the internal pressure within the clearinghouse was absolute. The silence from the administrative offices was the most telling indicator of the panic that had set in. Beneath the polished veneer of the commodity exchange, the reality was a brittle architecture of rehypothecated assets. Julian understood this mechanism better than anyone. He had built his entire strategy on the concept of leverage decay. When investors purchased paper silver, they were effectively betting on a price that was insulated from supply shocks by the sheer volume of derivatives. This market functioned because the clearinghouse operated on a fractional reserve basis. For every 100 contracts, they held maybe 1 bar of physical metal. This worked as long as the market participants were content with cash settlements and price tracking. But Julian's refusal to accept cash had shattered this fragile equilibrium. He spent the morning in his secure office, monitoring the real-time data streams that his team had spent years compiling. These streams were not public, they were a proprietary aggregate of logistical markers. They tracked warehouse power consumption, which peaked when vaults were being organized for audits, and personnel logs from the transport security firms that handled the heavy bullion cages. The data showed that while the exchange's public reports claimed steady inventory levels, the actual activity within the vault suggested a skeleton crew. "Julian, legal is on line 1, his assistant, Elena, said, her voice strained. "They are threatening an immediate injunction, claiming that your request is market manipulation designed to trigger a liquidity event." "Let them file," Julian replied, not looking up from the charts. "If they call a request for physical delivery market manipulation, then they are admitting that the entire market is a fraud. Tell them we are standing by the contract specifications to the letter. If the silver exists, there is no manipulation. If it doesn't, that is their problem, not mine." He knew that the exchange would attempt to bridge the supply gap by pulling metal from private industrial stockpiles, metal that was already promised to manufacturing partners. This was where the systemic risk crystallized. If the clearinghouse began cannibalizing industrial supplies to satisfy a single, high-net-worth delivery demand, they would trigger a secondary crisis in the manufacturing sector. Electronics, solar panel production, and medical equipment manufacturers would see their supply chains disrupted overnight. Julian's strategy was designed to force this exact cascade. He wasn't just exposing the exchange, he was turning the industrial sector against the financial elite. By noon, his team had leaked the preliminary evidence, not the full dump of Protocol Zero, but enough to alarm the industry leaders who relied on physical supply. The phone calls he received were no longer from regulators, but from CEOs of mid-cap tech firms demanding to know why their silver deliveries were being delayed or cancelled. The exchange was now fighting a two-front war. They were trying to silence Julian, while simultaneously trying to manage a revolt from the very industrial partners they were supposed to be servicing. Every move they made to keep the silver price down only deepened the chasm between the paper market and the reality on the ground. He looked out the window at the skyline, thinking about the nature of trust in the financial system. It was the only commodity that had no backup. You could print more money, you could invent more derivatives, but you could not print trust. When the market realized that the exchange had been lying about its capacity to deliver, the trust would evaporate, and with it, the artificial pricing mechanism that had defined the silver market for decades. Julian checked his watch. 24 hours remained. The project, the entire complex mechanism of the exchange's pricing and supply, was already showing signs of systemic fatigue. Volatility in the options market had spiked, and the basis trade, the spread between the futures price and the spot price, was widening to levels that suggested a total breakdown in arbitrage efficiency. He grabbed his coat. It was time for the final phase of the public pressure campaign. He had a meeting with an investigative journalist who had spent her career documenting the failures of commodity regulation. She didn't know the full extent of the Protocol Zero data, but she knew where the bodies were buried. Giving her the lead would ensure that, by the time the deadline hit tomorrow, the story would be front and center in the public consciousness. The game was no longer being played in the dark corners of the boardroom, it was entering the light. The exchange had rejected his final offer, but in doing so, they had given him the leverage he needed to dismantle the entire project. As he walked toward the elevator, he saw the security guards eyeing him, their usual indifference replaced by a palpable, nervous hostility. They knew something was happening, even if they didn't know what. Julian smiled. He was the man who had stopped the clock, and now he was going to watch the whole system run out of time. The morning of the third day dawned with a cold, gray light that seemed to mirror the mood on the trading floor of the exchange. The previous night had been a frantic blur of back-channel negotiations, desperate liquidity injections, and the quiet, frantic movement of bullion cages within the bowels of the vault system. Julian had slept for perhaps 2 hours, his mind racing through the permutations of the coming day. He knew that by the time the market bell rang, the exchange would be scrambling to find the 6 million ounces he had demanded. But 6 million ounces of silver is not a trivial amount. It is heavy, cumbersome, and, most importantly, it requires a paper trail that cannot be faked in an afternoon. As Julian arrived at his office, his screens were already glowing with the data from the early morning trading session. The silver price had started to decouple from the wider commodities index, surging upward with a velocity that indicated a massive short-covering event. Traders were beginning to realize that the impossible was happening, a major stakeholder was refusing to budge, and the exchange was blinking. "The regulators are here," Elena whispered as he stepped into the foyer. She looked pale, her hands shaking slightly as she held a tablet. "They aren't alone. There are 2 representatives from the Attorney General's office. And they've already served us with a motion for a temporary stay on your delivery demand." Julian walked past her toward his private office, his expression unreadable. "A stay? On the basis of what? National security? Market stability? Tell them they can wait. I'm not meeting with them until the deadline is reached. If the exchange wants to stop this, they need to produce the metal, not a piece of paper from a judge." He entered his office and locked the door, leaning against the frame for a brief moment of solitude. The tension was beginning to manifest in his own body, his heart rate was elevated, and his thoughts were becoming more tactical, less strategic. This was the point in the project where the human element always introduced noise. The lawyers, the regulators, the panicked executives, they were all acting out of fear. And fear was the primary motivator that would destroy their defense. He turned his attention back to the Protocol Zero data. He began to broadcast the telemetry of the vault activities to a select group of independent analysts and industrial supply managers he had spent years vetting. The data was raw, spreadsheet after spreadsheet of delivery anomalies, shipment failures, and rehypothecated serial numbers. By sending it now, he was forcing the market to process the information in real time. He was taking the black box of the exchange and breaking it open for the world to see. Within minutes, the impact was visible. The price of silver futures contracts for the current month had jumped another 5%. The spread, the gap between the price of the contract and the price of buying physical metal on the street, was becoming an unbridgeable canyon. The project, the exchange's carefully curated illusion that they could handle infinite delivery demands, was collapsing under the weight of its own dishonesty. Julian watched as the terminal displays showed the exchange's desperate attempts to source metal from secondary markets. They were buying at any price, trying to fill the deficit before the 5 p.m. deadline. It was a classic short squeeze, playing out in real time on a systemic level. The brokers who had been betting on the collapse of the silver price were being liquidated, their positions closed out at massive losses. He caught the glint of something on his television monitor, a news report from the lobby of the exchange. A reporter was talking about unusual volatility in the commodities market, referencing a mysterious delivery dispute that had triggered a series of margin calls across the financial district. They didn't mention his name, but they didn't need to. The market knew exactly who was behind the pressure. He sat down at his desk and pulled up the final contract document. The final offer the exchange had made, the one he had rejected, was still sitting in his inbox, a digital tombstone for their credibility. If they had simply offered a fair price for his silver, he might have walked away. But they had treated him with the same condescending arrogance they showed every retail investor who thought the system was fair. They had assumed he would take their paper money and fade away. Instead, he was going to force them to admit they had nothing left in the vaults. He looked at the time, 2 p.m. 3 hours to go. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of sirens, perhaps unrelated to his work, but in his heightened state, they sounded like the alarm bells for the entire industry. The project wasn't just stopped, it was unraveling. The machine was grinding to a halt, the gears stripped of their teeth by the sheer, unyielding force of physical reality. And for the first time in his life, Julian felt a profound, dangerous sense of peace. He had followed the rules, played the game, and now, he was watching the house of cards come crashing down. At 4 p.m., the atmosphere in the financial district had curdled into a palpable dread. The frantic buying that had characterized the afternoon had suddenly ceased, replaced by a eerie, frozen stillness. The silver market had essentially ceased to function as an exchange, it was now a crime scene. Julian sat in his office, his eyes fixed on the live feed of the exchange's clearing desk. The officers were no longer typing, they were staring at their screens, waiting for a signal that would never come. Julian knew the exact mechanism of their failure. The exchange's internal ledger system, the projected inventory management system, or PMS, relied on a continuous loop of optimistic reporting. It assumed that if a vault reported a certain amount of metal, that metal was available. It didn't account for the reality that the same bar of silver was often pledged to 4 different counterparties simultaneously. When Julian had demanded his physical delivery, he hadn't just asked for silver, he had asked for a specific subset of bars that were part of an industrial trust. By isolating these bars, he had essentially locked the gears of the PMS. The system couldn't reallocate the metal because he had legally tagged it for removal. The exchange, unable to paper over the deficit, had been forced to halt all outward movement of goods to prevent a total depletion of their remaining, tangible holdings. The project, the entire illusion of liquidity, had literally frozen in place to save the physical remnants of the vault. Julian, Elena said, stepping into the room without knocking. She didn't look scared anymore, she looked exhausted, and strangely, awestruck. The regulators are back. They've brought the exchange's chief operating officer with them. They aren't asking for an injunction anymore. They're asking for an audience. Julian stood up, adjusting his tie. He had spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment of confrontation. He walked to the conference room, where the air was thick with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. The COO, a man named Henderson who usually projected an air of untouchable corporate might, looked like he hadn't slept in a week. His suit was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew. "You have no idea what you've done," Henderson said, his voice devoid of the usual boardroom bluster. "You've triggered a domino effect that is going to impact every derivative market in the city. The pension funds, the index trackers, the institutional ETFs, they are all looking at a massive, systemic write-down because you refuse to accept a cash-out." Julian remained silent, letting the weight of Henderson's panic fill the room. This was the contrast framing he had relied upon, the contrast between the imaginary numbers on the screen and the hard, cold reality of the vault. "I didn't trigger anything, Henderson," Julian replied quietly. "You did. You created a market based on the assumption that no one would ever hold you to your promises. You sold paper silver that didn't exist, and you built a project that relied on the perpetual ignorance of your participants. All I did was ask for what I purchased. If the system is so fragile that a single legitimate request for delivery can cause a collapse, then the system was already dead. I just performed the autopsy." Henderson looked at the regulators, hoping for intervention, but they remained impassive. They were looking at the same data dumps Julian had provided. They weren't there to defend the exchange anymore, they were there to document the collapse and figure out how to mitigate the inevitable lawsuits from the institutional investors who were about to lose everything. "We can offer you a settlement," Henderson tried again, his desperation leaking through the cracks in his persona. "Double the spot price. Triple it. We'll authorize an immediate payment from the exchange's reserve fund." Julian shook his head. "The money is irrelevant. You can print dollars, but you cannot print the integrity of a contract. The public needs to know that this exchange is empty. The industries that rely on this metal need to know that you are effectively insolvent. If I take your money, I'm just complicit in your fraud. I'm not here for a payout. I'm here for the delivery of the metal, or I'm here to watch you announce your inability to fulfill your obligations." The room went silent. The reality of his position was absolute. He wasn't a trader trying to make a profit, he was a revolutionary tearing down an architecture of lies. The regulators started whispering amongst themselves, their pens moving rapidly across their pads. They were no longer the enforcers of the exchange's will, they were the historians of its demise. Julian looked at his watch. 4:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the official close of the trading day. In 15 minutes, the exchange would be required to publish its end-of-day inventory report. If that report showed that he had been denied his delivery, the news would be broadcast to every terminal in the world. The run on the vaults, not just for his silver, but for everyone's, would begin. The project was already over, now, it was just a matter of the official record. The clock on the wall of the conference room ticked with agonizing precision, each second a hammer blow against the dwindling credibility of the exchange. Julian watched the faces of the men across from him. Henderson's bravado had fully evaporated, replaced by a hollow, vacant look of someone watching their life's work disintegrate in real time. The regulators were no longer negotiating, they were busy documenting the final hours of a dying institution. At 4:59 p.m., the terminal on the table flickered to life. The final, mandatory daily inventory report for the exchange was being pushed to the public feed. The room went deathly silent as the numbers populated. The registered category, which had hovered at a fraudulent baseline for months, showed a sudden, catastrophic drop. Beneath it, the pending delivery column for Julian's account flashed in a stark, bold red, incomplete. The revelation was instantaneous. Across the globe, the algorithmic trading bots, programmed to react to supply shocks, detected the anomaly. Within seconds, the price of silver didn't just rise, it decoupled from reality. The paper contracts that had been used to suppress the price for decades began to be liquidated in a firestorm of margin calls. The project had officially stopped. The exchange had admitted, through its own digital interface, that it could not fulfill its core promise. Henderson slumped forward, burying his face in his hands. The regulators stood up, their duty now shifted to the containment of the fallout. They didn't even look at Julian as they gathered their files and departed. They had no jurisdiction over the truth, and the truth had just been laid bare for the entire world to see. Julian felt no surge of triumph, only a quiet, grounded finality. He had spent his career as an auditor of reality, and today, the books had finally balanced. He walked out of the conference room and into the main office area. The staff was standing at their desks, mesmerized by the monitors. They were watching the financial news networks, where commentators were scrambling to explain why the commodities market was currently in a state of total, uncontrolled volatility. They were using words like unprecedented, systemic failure, and black swan. Julian didn't linger. He grabbed his coat and walked toward the elevator. As he passed the lobby, he saw the security guards once again. They were staring at their own phones, the news of the collapse already circulating through their internal channels. He caught the eye of the head guard, who looked up with a mix of fear and newfound respect. He held the door for Julian, not out of protocol, but out of a visceral understanding that the man walking past him had changed the world. Stepping out onto the street, the city felt different. The air was cold, biting, and honest. The lights of the skyscrapers loomed overhead, the symbols of an empire that had been built on debt and paper promises. But beneath the surface, the physical world remained. Silver, metal, tangible assets, these things still existed, indifferent to the chaos happening in the digital tickers above. He walked several blocks, breathing in the city's chaotic energy. His phone buzzed incessantly, requests for interviews, threats from institutional partners, desperate pleas from traders he barely knew. He turned the device off and dropped it into a trash bin on the corner. The script he had followed was complete. He had forced the hand of the establishment, and they had folded. The project of the paper-silver market had stopped, and while the economic shockwaves would be felt for months to come, the era of the great illusion was over. He reached a small park and sat on a bench, watching the people pass by. They were completely unaware that the financial ground beneath their feet had just shifted. They went about their lives, buying their coffees and catching their trains, oblivious to the fact that the architecture of their wealth had been exposed as a hollow shell. Julian watched them, feeling a strange sense of empathy. He had shown them the truth, even if they weren't yet ready to see it. The story of the bank's rejection was no longer a secret, it was now the opening chapter of a new reality. The project had been stopped not by a government order or a market crash, but by a single person who had the audacity to demand the truth. He stood up, pulled his collar against the wind, and began to walk, disappearing into the crowd. The story, and the man, they were all moving forward, leaving the empty vaults behind. The audit was done, the price was paid, and for the first time, the silver